All right. Hi, welcome to my final assignment. My name is Ali Moreno, and I will be talking about depth perception. And this picture is just kind of a foreshadow that things that you see might be closer or farther. So we have an introduction of the paper that I read, kind of some of the historical background of it, a summary followed by an analysis, conclusion, closing thoughts, and the And this is kind of also showing depth perception because the person here seems smaller than this person, but it's all about where you're from. Like this big structure looks huge because you're up close. So let's get right into it. So the paper that I read was entitled The Visual Cliff, written by Eleanor J. Gibson and Richard D. Walk, published in the Scientific American in April of 1960. And obviously, there has been a lot since that, probably in the study of depth perception, which we are going to get into shortly. So, this research mainly focuses on depth perception in both animals and about 6 to 10 months old. So, I like this illustration a lot because it shows really well kind of how the baby would see it and how we can see it from all of the elements. So, the study is exploring how early in these kinds of species can perceive depth or like height in this example. So, how those different species rely on sensory cues to achieve, obviously, not falling. So, some of the theory behind this is that Gibson actually did other studies before this with rats and other animals. So, now this particular research aimed to determine if depth perception was innate or learned. And this has been a really big historical argument about whether behavior is genetic or externally determined. So this is just kind of another one of the foundational papers. So the theoretical background was a lot like the nativist view, showing that human infants can perceive depth and avoid the cliff. So the impact on cognitive is how they develop and that psychology behind it. And then obviously we talked about, but also the sensory. So being able to see this path and motion cues, understanding how that works in the young thing's mind. So I also read reviews on it, and apparently it's pretty highly regarded and referenced in many studies, mainly as a foundational point. So people use this kind of research to be like, oh, so depth perception is a thing, but there's obviously a lot of complexity too, and a lot of implications behind this kind of research that either they just didn't think about or they just weren't really there yet scientifically in the 60s. So, some critiques that were against this methodological. So, the visual glyphs might not replicate natural environments very well, and other critiques, like what the baby might be hearing, smelling during this environment, might have swayed their opinions on what to do. So, and this one is talking about the animals more. So, let's say one was a turtle. If it's just a plain box like this, it's not going to act the way it would in the wild. So, that might not replicate their natural behavior because they're not in their natural environment. And theoretically, apparently Gibson had done more work after this, and so he had more ideas presented past this. So his affordance of direct perception kind of went along more with this. And so it starts out, oh, I also have each of the specimens that were sent up here if we ever forget as we're going through. So the research question was how and when the animals develop perception and what visual cues are necessary for the ability. You would think it's just visual, but there's apparently a lot that goes into it. So the methods, there's a visual cliff, which is really just a high table, and then there was a really thick piece of glass right with a board laid down on top of it. So if the baby was crawling, it couldn't actually fall because there was a piece of glass, but it wouldn't know that. So the shallow was the one up here. You also had the deep side, and they had like a checkerboard surface. So the baby sees big checkerboards on the shallow side and really small ones. So it understands if we were to move from location A to B, it would have to fall to get to the smaller checkerboard. And then kind of the findings that they found was that humans around 6 to 10 months old show clear depth perception. They avoided the deep side and they used the tactile evidence. And then goats, they could also understand depth perception. They preferred the shallow side. Kittens, excellent. They freeze or circling on the deep side. They just, yeah. Rats are a little bit different. Since their whiskers are like really low to the ground, they use more of like tactile cues, but show pretty good depth perception from their whiskers not reaching the glass. Turtles don't really show the best, unfortunately, with 76 choosing the shallow side, which is obviously different from the rest of them. So, and also something different, rats and day-old chicks apparently rely on motion parallax, so that pattern density to understand depth, which that could be something else about just the way that they are designed genetically. So this one also just kind of is a really big constituent for the fact that it's influenced by both innate and environmental factors, which I've studied in my animal behavior. That's mainly the you're going to find here is that behavior is not genetically determined or environmentally, it's a combination. Let's move on. And this is just a table explaining the things that I've already said, but humans, goats, kittens, really, really good at this stuff. But then without whiskers, rats are pretty good at depth perception, even without the tactile. They also had control groups, like any good experiment does. And then you saw that there was no preference, because obviously the whiskers. And then over here, talking about the infant rats and chicks, showing the 100% when it comes to the motion parallax that we were talking about again. And then we have just a good analysis on everything that we've covered. Well, everything that was in the paper. I thought that the design was really creative for the 60s. I mean, the visual cliff, I don't know anything else that I've seen do anything like that. I mean, of course, they didn't really have many technological advances back then, but when it comes to depth perception, the checkerboard, it just it unlocks a lot of neurological things like that motion parallax we talked about. So it also isolates the visual from the tactile cues, which I thought was interesting. And then, especially the cross species comparison, I just finished actually my comparative anatomy course, and so I have a special appreciation for comparing different animals and humans, especially neurologically. I mean, obviously, these animals have different things that they've adapted to over time. So it would make sense that they would all have some kind of evolutionary thing that will keep them from going over the cliff. And then the controls, they mainly are just to eliminate potential biases and to isolate those cues and strengthen the findings. The weaknesses, um, there weren't many sample sizes, which makes it kind of hard for you or other kind of scientists to reproduce that kind of experiment and to apply that information. Like, I don't know how many times they would have needed to do it to really enforce that because I feel like it's pretty self explanatory. But just for the legalities of it, it's always good to have a lot of sample sizes. Um, the environmental factors, the laboratory obviously isn't the best place because it can't really replicate those natural environments like we talked about. So that's where I got this picture from that I feel like illustrates that point very well, is that even though this is more of like a stair than like a visual cliff, this frog basically has a lot of its natural environment around it, so it might act a little more like it would if it were in the wild and feel like it might be more comfortable to take risks. I don't know, you could debate a lot behind that, but yeah, the simple square box might have influenced it. Um, and then they don't really explore learning much. They just kind of take them when they're really young. So maybe in the future they could have a specimen and see if they learn over time or not. And then this picture was just a rat here shown in the same kind of experiment, but mainly also just kind of showing what the motion parallax would look like for this one. Because the implications of these findings, I thought it was interesting how visual cues, that like that pattern density is so important for them, and how like that motion parallax works in the rats and like the day-old chicks. But visual cues are actually really critical for the survival of rats and chicks. And obviously, the ability is pretty innate because they are obviously still alive and still evolving with that trait to keep them alive in the wild, or the lack thereof when it comes to chicks nowadays. But depth perception is universal, no matter what the species is. And it is critical for survival because only the best traits evolve into the next generation. So if there was a cliff and animals didn't really understand what was happening, yeah, you get it. So the advancements in cognitive science, like I said, it just basically laid the groundwork for further research in neural and psychological processes involved in depth perception. So there's been much more papers now with a lot better technology and more things about it, but the mechanisms underlying that depth perception has it kind of opened up kind of a lot of doors for these kinds of studies to even begin, especially the cross species part of it. Using the cats, the goats, the rats, like that is very comparative for cognitive science, and you can kind of see like how different parts of the brain in those animals might have contributed to the fact that it is universal. Like it doesn't matter if you're a baby or if you're a kitten, like it's going to be the same thing, preferring the shallow side rather than deep. So that process across different species is adaptive. And then just kind of some reflections that I had. Um, the first thing that kind of came to my mind when I was going through this also was that this study actually does prove relevance, even if it was written a long time ago. Because in robotics, we're understanding that depth perception is actually crucial for designing intelligent systems. So, for instance, Tesla and Elon Musk, they're trying to create these robots that can maneuver difficult landscapes. And there was this study I saw where this robot is learning to go downhill in understanding how going from location A to location B or shallow to deep requires a different set of visual cues and like that motion parallax. So just it failed a few times and the robot had to understand what that meant, but depth perception is really important. So research like this lay the groundwork for something like this to happen. So yeah, one of the questions I had was what kind of early experiences could refine depth perception? Like a cat and a turtle, like obviously that has to be different. And then how could it be modified? So dynamic seats. All right, and then in conclusion, the visual cliff did a lot for the development of psychology across different species. And the use of this apparatus allowed for a lot of different kinds of evidences to be used for different papers. And then the findings of these just really laid the groundwork for it. So, developmental psychology, just that sensory experience has helped with a lot. And artificial intelligence might be very, very useful for this information. So, ghosty kittens, excellent depth perception. Rats, mainly tactile cues. Turtles, not as well, but that's okay. And humans, we know what's going on. And in closing, a lot of evolutionary significance in depth perception, enduring impact across psychology, neuroscience, and technology. Right, there's my bibliography with all my sources. Thank you.